Okay, so continue our Gemara on the bottom of Ayin Vav Amud Beis. Was Ayin Zayin Amud Aleph? I'm sorry. 77a. And the last thing we did was we proved from the scripture that not wearing shoes constitutes as inui, as self-affliction. In that, when King David was running away from Avshalom, he was not wearing shoes. And the next generation, when Shlomo Melech reminds Avisar of the time he afflicted himself with King David, reminding him of the time he left and ran away he was loyal to King David and ran away from Avshalom, King Shlomo refers to that period as the time you afflicted yourself, thus proving that whatever King David was engaged with at the time when he was running away from Avshalom constitute as affliction, this word inui. And thus we could apply the same meaning to the word inui, to the word affliction with Yom Kippur. And we demonstrated that King David was running Yachov, which means barefoot, and we proved from elsewhere that Yachov actually means barefoot, as opposed to without a horse or tattered shoes, but actually barefoot. Now the Gemara is going to do a similar thing with respect to the next item, which is forbidden. Is this the last item? Right? We talked about how not eating and drinking is called inui, self-affliction. We talked about bathing. We talked about anointing. Now we talked about not wearing leather shoes. And now the final item is washing. Now what's interesting is when we prove that washing, relations is the last one. Relations are the last one. Right, but then after we prove that relations can constitute inui, constitute a self-affliction, we're going to get to the actual detailed halachas, starting with not washing on Yom Kippur. What I hope to do is, we're going to learn the Gemara as is, give a little background as we go through, as we always attempt to do, and then when we finish the subject from the Gemara of not washing on Yom Kippur, we'll look at it from the Code of Jewish Law. So we'll get to practical, and we'll have known where it came from in the Gemara. So as we go through the Gemara, pin these very ideas in your head, and then you're going to see how they play out in halacha later. But as we go along, we'll mention at least the basic ideas as we go along. Okay, so we're at the bottom of the page, and the Gemara says, Tashmish Hamita, second last word in the second to last line. Tashmish Hamita, marital relations. The Ikra Inui, refraining from marital relations as being defined as affliction, as being defined as Inui. Minalon, where do we know this? See if we know this from the verse where Laban, in Bereshis, Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Nun. Yes, that's what it says there. Bereshis, chapter 31, verse 50, where when Laban and Yaakov are finally departing from each other, they build a little mount, Eida Galazeh, and Laban gives a speech to his son-in-law and says, you better take care of my daughters. That's the short of his speech. And there he says as follows, Im tanes benoisi, im tikach nashim, if you will tana, using this word ino, if you will afflict pain on my daughters, im tikach nashim, or you'll take wives, then I'll be very upset at you, and God is my witness that you wronged me. Essentially, that's what he says. So what's the double expression here? The second thing he says is clear. Don't take other wives. Treat my daughters. He married two of his daughters, and he sent with her two maids, right? Yaakov married Leah and Rachel, both daughters of Laban, and he sent along Bilhah and Zilpah, two maids, one maid for each daughter. So when it says don't take other wives, don't have other wives, and that way you won't overlook my daughter's needs. It's clear. But what is imtana? What is do not afflict my daughters? So explains the Gemara, imtana, when Laban says do not, or lest you afflict my daughters, using this word inui, mitashmish, you refrain from giving them their conjugal rights. That's what Laban is telling them. Telling his son-in-law, don't neglect my wife, don't neglect my daughters, and give them their rights as married women. So thus we see that the word inui, the word tana, is used to describe refraining from marital relations. Following? And then vim tikach, and then when it says, and do not take other wives, mitzaris, meaning don't take other wives. Other sister wives in Lashon HaKodesh are called tzaris. Tzaris. You have multiple wives, it causes you tzaris. One's enough. More would be tzaris. Okay. So that's the first thing that's what he tells him. Don't neglect my wives from giving them their conjugal rights, using this word inui, thus teaching us that inui on Yom Kippur, self-affliction means refraining from marital relations. And then he says, don't take other wives. He's saying, God's my witness that you have wronged me and God will. It's a good question. Why would he care? I'm sure there's multiple layers, but you can give like a historical background in that, historically speaking, people were accepting of the fact that you had your God, I have my God. What was unique about the Jewish people is that we had one God for all people. And we said, no, that's your God too. But culturally, I have my God, you have your God. So I'm going to swear by your God. It's not an uncommon thing. And like, even in Greek mythology, it's not uncommon. That's what I'm saying. He knew, people understood, like, I know that the God of Chreisnish, some other religion, is important to that person. I'm still never going to swear by that God because it's a false deity, right? But back in the old day, if you weren't monotheistic and you didn't believe there was one God for the whole world and you believe there was multiple gods, okay, so you have your God, I have my God, and I'm going to swear by your God against you because I want you to be scared, right? So it wasn't uncommon that people validated other people's gods.
You can't avoid criticism.
Yeah.
I was with the kids, the grandchildren. One of them is Adina. And she asked me, she's 6 years old, where's my name coming? I looked it up. Adina was Laban's wife. And she brought up.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she brought up 2 girls.
Laban's wife was Adina. Laban's wife was Adina? I didn't know that. Adina with the Aleph.
A-D-I-N-E.
I didn't know that.
And she brought up 2 girls.
Rachel and Leah.
Very, very religious.
Very interesting. Even with a husband like that. Okay. So the Gemara now is going to suggest, that's interesting. The Gemara is going to suggest other readings to this verse in Tanem Tikach. And that way, in other words, in order to prove that when Laban says, do not afflict pain upon my daughters, it means don't deny them their conjugal rights, we have to avoid any other possible interpretation of the verse. And that's going to solidify our reading that in Tana indeed means do not refrain, do not deny them their conjugal rights. So the Gemara is now going to suggest other options of how to interpret the verse, negate them, thus solidifying our proof. So it says the Gemara like this. The Yoma, perhaps, idi v'idi mitzaris. Both of them, im tana and im tikach, is a double expression for the same thing. Do not take other wives. Who said it means denying conjugal rights? Says the Gemara, miksiv im tikach. Does it say im tana, lest you afflict, lest you take? It says v'im tikach, and lest you take, thus implying it's a separate item. If it's a double expression and the second one is just an interpretation of the first, I mean, don't afflict them, don't take other wives. Had he said that, then it would be clear. When he said afflicted, he means what I'm about to say, don't take other wives. But because it says don't afflict them and don't take other wives, thus it implies that there are 2 separate items. And that's how we know that the first one means don't deny them conjugal rights. And that's proving that Tana means inui, self-affliction means to avoid marital relations. The Gemara suggests further another reading. Ve'ema, perhaps, idi v'idi mitzaris. Maybe both of them mean refrain from taking other wives. But chad mitzaris today, one means don't take other wives from the wives you already have. That is to say, this is the way Rashi explains it, don't take Bilhah and Zilpah and make them primary wives, replacing my daughters. And then he says, don't take v'chad mitzaris ta'asin l'ma'alma, and then don't take other wives. Sorry? No, so that's why I said specifically, don't make Bilhah and Zilpah more important than my daughters. He didn't, the way Rashi at least interprets it, he didn't forbade Yaakov from marrying Bilhah and Zilpah, but he forbade Yaakov from making them more primary than his daughters. It would seem like it was a common thing. Your wives' maids are meant for you too. But remember, this is your wife and this is your maid. Just know what's what. That's what it seems like what Laban is saying. And dum yudim tikach, and then both of the items would be similar. Don't afflict my daughters by making Bila and Zilpah primary, and then don't take other wives. Says the Gemara, no. Miksivim tikach v'mtana, imtana v'mtikach. Look at which one comes first. What comes first is don't afflict pain, and second, don't take. Where it says don't take, it's clearly taking from somewhere else, taking wives from somewhere else. And therefore, the first one is what you're suggesting, where it says don't afflict pain, you're suggesting that means don't make Bila and Zilpah more important than my daughters. Now, which one's worse? What's worse is taking wives from somewhere else than taking the women I gave you and making them more important. And apparently, the way Rashi interprets it, the proper way to warn someone is to first tell them, don't you dare do that thing, and even this, meaning first you tell them the worst thing, and then you say don't even do that. So it'd be more appropriate for him to say, don't take other wives, and not only that, don't even make the wives I gave you more important than my daughters. And therefore, the term should have been imtikach, then imtana. Don't take, and then don't afflict, rather than imtana, don't afflict, and then don't take. And therefore, we are solidified in our reading that imtana, don't afflict my daughters, Laban means don't deny them conjugal rights. And thus we know that inui, affliction, means refraining from conjugal rights. And therefore, when Torah says afflict yourself on Yom Kippur, it means don't engage in marital relations. Then the Gemara says like this. Papa said to Abaye, there's a curious thing here, and it might throw a wrench in our reading. Because you are suggesting from this verse that don't afflict pain upon my daughters means do not deny them their conjugal rights. But I have a proof from the verse that marital relations itself is considered painful, is considered affliction. From where it says, this is with the story of Dinah. And there it says that Shem, son of Hamor, engaged in marital relations with Yaakov's daughter Dinah. This is what led to Shimon and Levi going and destroying the town. Right? And there it says he lay with her and he afflicted her. So it would seem that marital relations itself is affliction. Amalei, so Papa said to Abaye, responded to Papa, depends on how you do it. Hasam there, there's different ways of understanding this. I'll give you the second interpretation of Rashi first, and then the first interpretation. Second interpretation of Rashi is that he afflicted her because he engaged with her in an irregular way. It's to say, not through the orifice that one is meant to have relations, but the other orifice next door. And that is painful. So says the Gemara, Papa says, look, there's a verse here which says that marital relations is affliction. Abaye says, well, it depends how you do it. Talking about a husband and wife, it's not painful. You're talking about some crazy guy with a young girl and treating her like that, and not even doing it normally. That's painful. Another reading actually of Rashi is, and this seems to be a more accurate reading in terms of like the Gemara's halacha, is that Dinah actually wanted to be with him. And he said no. And then when she said, you know what, I'm not interested, then he took her. She said at one point, okay, you know what, I'm not interested anymore. And that's when he took her. So in this case, the pain is not a question of where he inserted himself, but rather the fact that he raped her. That she said, yes, I want. And well, actually, technically speaking, the affliction here is that he didn't give it to her when she wanted it. Sorry? What are you reading? That's what I'm saying. No. She wanted him. He didn't. When she was with him and she wanted, he said no. Oh, I don't know when it is. Maybe it's afterwards. It doesn't say liyam like later. It doesn't say mean that it was afterwards. Maybe it was afterwards. Maybe you're right. Maybe after he raped her, then he denied her conjugal rights. And that's considered affliction. Either way, two versions of what this affliction was, either because the act itself was painful, therefore because it was unusual, or he denied her when she wanted it. And that's the pain. Either way, we're sticking with our original interpretation that inui, affliction, means to refrain from marital relations, and that's what we know. That in Yom Kippur, it's forbidden to be in marital relations. Okay, now let's begin the halachas of washing on Yom Kippur. And again, this goes for about a page and a bit. And when we're done, we're going to look at the actual code of Jewish laws from after Rabbi the Shulchan Aruch. So we can get the actual practical halacha, even though it's pretty practical from the Gemara itself, but nonetheless, it's good to do that. Okay, Tana Rabbanan, our sages taught. Aser lichaytz mikzas gufay kechal gufay. It's forbidden on Yom Kippur to wash part of your body, just as it is forbidden to wash your entire body. However, there is a few caveats, as the Gemara is going to go on and say. The underpinning rule, and this is what emerges from the Shulchan Aruch, and when we learn the Shulchan Aruch, we see quite clearly that if the washing is A, not your whole body, B, not with the intention of pleasure, but for some other purpose, then it's forbidden. Then it's permissible. On Yom Kippur, again, so I'm going to make this is the principle. Don't apply the principle yourself. Speak to your local Orthodox rabbi. And again, when we finish this sugya in the Gemara, we're going to look at the Shulchan Aruch and we'll see the practical law. But this is the principle. If you aren't washing your entire body, A, B, what the part of your body you're washing, only part of it, you're not doing it for the sake of pleasure, you're doing it for some other purpose, then it's permissible on Yom Kippur. So what's the first and most simple example, says the Gemara? If his hands were, or some part of his body was dirty with excrement and cement, literally, mortar, mud, it would seem like you'll no doubt remember Gemara Brachas we went a couple of years back, and there it talks about going to the bathroom, and people used to wipe themselves using stones and earth. So it seemed like that's what it's talking about, a part of his body that's dirty with, it's dirty. Used to use dry clay, mortar, or some dry clay or some smooth stone. Right, we even had it on Shabbos about preparing smooth stones on Shabbos. It's important for halacha, muktzah, which stones are muktzah, which ones are not, because you may be able to use them, not to use them. See how spoiled we are? We have 3-ply tissue, soft 3-ply tissue, something you don't even think about. But in the Gemara, it's a whole subject. So here on Yom Kippur, he's dirty. What is he going to do? So over here now, Reichitz Kedarke can wash himself as he normally does, and he shouldn't be concerned with the fact that he's violating the prohibition on Yom Kippur of washing. Because as I mentioned, there's 2 conditions being fulfilled here. Number 1, it's only part of his body, and B, he's not doing it because he wants to enjoy himself. He's doing it because he's dirty. So there's a side reason why he's washing his hand, why he's washing that part of his body or his hands, whatever part of his body is dirty. These 2 conditions. It's not his whole body, A. B, he's not doing it for the sake of pleasure. He's doing it for some other purpose. In this case, to clean himself. Then it's permissible. And this is indeed the halacha, as we'll see. Same thing with anointing oneself. Aser lochotz lasoch mikzas gufay. It's forbidden to. I'm going to pull up Stein's out here because it gives a different interesting thing. It's forbidden to anoint oneself. Mikzas gufay, part of one body, kechol gufay, just like it's forbidden to anoint oneself on the entire body. But then it's a similar thing that if these 2 conditions apply, if it's only part of the body, and B, it's not for the sake of enjoyment, it's just for some other reason, then it's permissible. And actually, I don't know if the first condition here applies. I shouldn't say that. Okay, put a pin in that. I'm not sure. When we get to the Shulchan Aruch, we'll see that. But if he was sick, or he had some lesions on his head. So I think it is. Right? Scalps on his head. Yes. So for medicinal purposes, he's allowed to. So that's what I said. I'm not sure if this applies to only if it's part of the body. I'm not sure. It could be it applies to the whole body. Also, I don't know. When we get to the Shulchan Aruch, we'll look at that more. So let's put a pin in that. But for now, the Gemara says if you're sick, you can put ointments on for medicinal purposes, or if there's scabs, or some sort of lesions on your head, and you need some ointment. That's a good question. That's a very good question. The primary concern with medicinal things on Shabbos and Yom Tif is with pills. It's less so with creams. And even when it comes to creams, there are ways you can do it. But you can't actually rub it and smear it. But for example, you can stick your hands into oil if you need to moisturize your hands, as opposed to rubbing it into your hands. So I imagine the same thing's here on Yom Kippur. But it's a very interesting point. And Maybe. No, the problem with Shabbos is not because of the way it looks, because you might ground it. Nothing to do with the way people look at it. That's what I'm saying. The primary thing is pills, because the primary reason why you don't take medicinal things on Shabbos is because we're concerned you're going to grind it up. That's why they used to take medicinal things by grinding them up. It's a primary concern. But even so, the Alter writes you can't rub your oil on your hand. You have to put your hands in. Put it in. Anyway, the truth is that I did not get to look up the Shulchan Aruch on this subject, because it's going to come up again later. The issue of rubbing, the issue of ointing, the primary discussion is going to be about washing. So that's why I said we'll put a pin in this. And God willing, when we get to that part of the Gemara, we'll look at the Shulchan Aruch as well, about the details of practical law in terms of pointing ointments on Yom Kippur. But for now, we're looking at the issue of washing specifically. And here's an interesting thing. We'll conclude with this part of the Gemara. Tana Devei Menashe. We've been taught in the house of Menashe, I guess, the study hall of Menashe. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Madicha isha yada achas. A woman can wash one of her hands b'mayim in water. The noisena is pas latinoik, so that she can feed bread to her children. And she should not be concerned. I'm translating literally. I'll explain in a minute what this means. It's Rashi. There's a Tosfos, and it has interesting derivations. And she should not be concerned with washing on Yom Kippur, because she's washing her hand to feed her children. They said about Shammai the elder, that is to say, Shammai of the house of Shammai, the original Shammai, that he didn't want to feed his children with one hand on Shabbat, on Yom Kippur. The Gazrolov, and they imposed upon him to feed his children with two hands. They want to prove the point. Okay, so what's going on here? Why wouldn't he want to feed his children? Says the Gemara, my time was the reason. Amar Abai says Mishum Shifta, because of a shade, because of a demonic. Rephrase that. Because of a negative spiritual force known as Shifta. What is this? So Rashi says that this is a reference to Nitliat Yodayim in the morning. Washing one's hands in the morning. And washing one's hands in the morning has a number of different layers to it. One reason is simply because before you pray, you have to wash your hands. And it's literally a question of cleanliness. When you sleep at night, your hands are busy. They touch all kinds of parts of your body. And when you wake up in the morning, you want to have clean hands for prayer. And therefore, before you make a bracha, which is the first thing you do in the morning, you're making all kinds of brachas right away in the morning, so you wash your hands. That's one reason. Another reason is, even though it sounds mystical, but it's actually from the Gemara, certainly according to the Rashba, according to many others, which is ruach ra. There's a negative spirit that attaches itself to one's body when one sleeps, and when one wakes up, it leaves the entire body minus the hands, and thus we wash our hands to rid ourselves of that negative spirit. The Zohar adds another layer, because another layer to what degree, how negative is this, how bad is this negative spiritual force, and what are we fighting against? Like, it's on my hand, what's it going to do? So the primary concern, at least from the Gemara, is touching different parts of your body, touching your nose, touching your eyes, touching your ears, and touching food. The Zohar adds even walking, which is why those who are inclined to do so have a washing basin set up next to their bed before they go to sleep, so that their feet don't touch the ground before they wash their hands. And then they wash their hands again after going to the bathroom with the bracha. That's for another time. We can talk about the details in the Nitliat Yodayim. Very fascinating sugya. But for the purpose of this conversation, Rashi says that this negative spirit, which comes on the hand, is named Shifta, not Shifta. And therefore, this woman who wants to wash her hand is because we just said before that this negative spirit is especially bad if you're touching parts of your body and if you're touching food. So she has to feed her children. So she's giving them food, and therefore she's washing her hand. And the Gemara is saying it's okay. It's for the safety of the child, because there's a negative spiritual energy on her hand. And if she touches food and feeds her child, it's going to be a bad thing. And therefore Shammai didn't want to do that, because Shammai didn't want to feed his children. He didn't want to wash his hands in Yom Kippur, even for the sake of feeding his children. Therefore, he wouldn't feed them. And therefore, says the Gemara, they imposed upon him, you better feed your children with two hands. which means, according to Rashi, Shammai spent the entire Yom Kippur not touching his eyes, nose, or ears, because he has that negative spirit known as Shifta, according to Rashi, which comes in the morning, and he didn't wash his hands because it's Yom Kippur, right? Which means he spent his entire Yom Kippur not touching his eyes, nose, and ears. But Tosfos, however, says that's not what this is talking about. The washing your hands in the morning, you have to do that in Yom Kippur. You have to. And that's the halacha. We wash our hands up until our knuckles. Not to our knuckles, till our, what's this called? Not the knuckles, not here. That's the knuckles, right? What's this called? Both called knuckles. Okay, this is the knuckle that, the bone that attaches your fingers to your palm. Up until that point. That's what, you have to wash in Yom Kippur in the morning. You cannot daven before you do that. That's what Tosfos basically argues. Even for the Ruach Ra, whatever it is. So what's this business with Shifta and this business of women washing their hands before they feed their children? Says Tosfos like this. We've had this conversation in the past that back in the earlier days when the world was on a more spiritual state, that meant they had more spiritual positive energy and also more spiritual negative energy. Considering that they had more positive, considering the fact that they had negative spiritual energies, there was this thing called Shifta, a negative spiritual energy. And this thing would cause children to choke while they ate if the person handling the food didn't wash their hands. So this meant, says Tosfos, that in the times of the Gemara, every single time a mother fed her children, she would wash her hands before she fed them, irrespective of washing in the morning. Unrelated. And this is the way but Tosfos says that today it's no longer a concern, like other things in the Gemara's time that were concerned, that today aren't a concern. He actually mentions two things, which actually some people do still some people still are concerned about, Giloy and Zilgois, but irrespective, Tosfos says it's no longer a concern today. This shift the business of choking children in their food, making the mother have to wash her hands. Bottom line being, if we can go with Tosfos' version, and that means like this. When the Gemara says that a woman's allowed to wash her hands to feed her children, which would mean if you're not feeding your children, you cannot wash your hands. That's specifically referring to washing for the sake of handling food, not for washing in the morning. Washing in the morning is permissible anyway. And again, it qualifies the two criteria mentioned before. When you wash your hands up until your knuckle in the morning on Yom Kippur, it qualifies for both of the conditions. A, it's not your whole body, and B, you're not doing it for pleasure, you're doing it for the halacha. You're doing it for mitzvah, you're doing it for safety of getting rid of the negative spiritual energy. But either way, it's not for your enjoyment and it's not your whole body. And that remains the halacha that you should, you're allowed to. You have to wash your hands in the morning on Yom Kippur, but only until the second knuckle, only until the point that your fingers meet your palm. God willing, more such halachas of times when people can get almost their entire body wet, walk through a river, so long as your head's not under the water, on Yom Kippur. And we'll get into those details, God willing, tomorrow.
I guess we're working. I watched